The sun was already warm that morning, and the air carried that gentle buzz that made everything feel alive. It was the first summer since Daniel had finished building his backyard pool, and he couldn't be prouder of how it turned out. Every time he looked out from his kitchen window and saw the sunlight glimmering across the water, it reminded him of how far he'd come. It had taken years of saving, months of planning, and countless late nights going over designs with contractors. But it was finally done. A small piece of paradise right behind his house. His kids loved it. His wife called it her quiet place, and Daniel thought of it as his reward after years of hard work. On weekends, the backyard would come alive with laughter and the splash of water. Sometimes neighbors walking by would wave, smile, or even stop to compliment the setup. The pool had this light blue glow when the sun hit it just right, and the new fence he had installed around it gave their home a cozy sense of privacy. It was peaceful, something he had always wanted. The neighborhood was managed by a homeowners association, something Daniel hadn't thought much about when he moved in. He paid the annual fees, followed the rules, and didn't bother anyone. He liked things neat and organized anyway, so it all seemed fine. But not everyone saw things that way. Just a few houses down lived a woman who was, by all means, the unofficial queen of the neighborhood. She was always around, walking her dog, checking on lawns, snapping pictures of other people's yards as if she worked for the city. Her name wasn't important. Everyone just called her the HOA lady. Some even called her Karen behind her back, a nickname that spread quietly through whispers at block parties and mailboxes. Daniel had barely spoken to her when he first moved in. She had waved once or twice, but that was it. He figured she was just a strict rule follower. But after the pool was built, her attitude toward him seemed to change overnight. It started small. One morning he found a yellow envelope taped to his mailbox. Inside was a notice from the HOA stating that his pool umbrella was non-compliant with community standards. Daniel laughed at the note and figured it must be a mistake. The umbrella was beige, hardly something anyone could call offensive. Still, he replaced it with a plain white one just to avoid trouble. Then came another letter. This time it said his fence was 2 inches taller than allowed. 2 inches. He couldn't believe it. The city permit he had gotten clearly approved the height, and he made sure everything followed the HOA's published rules. He wrote a polite email to the HOA explaining the measurements, attached the documents, and thought that would be the end of it. But within a week, another notice appeared. This time it wasn't about the fence, it was about the pool itself. The letter stated that Daniel had violated HOA regulations by maintaining a private swimming area inconsistent with community use standards, and he read it 3 times, not sure what it even meant. Private swimming area? Inconsistent with community use. It was his property, his pool, his money. He showed the letter to his wife, who frowned and said, "What do they mean by that?" "It's your pool. You built it in your yard." "That's what I'm trying to figure out," he said, setting the letter down. "This makes no sense." A few days later, he got a bill in the mail. The HOA had fined him $250 for unauthorized private use of a community access feature. He couldn't believe his eyes. Community access feature? His pool wasn't even visible from the street. Daniel decided to handle things calmly. He went to the next HOA meeting, thinking he could clear up the misunderstanding face to face. The meeting was held in a small community hall. When he arrived, there were about a dozen people sitting in a semicircle, and right in the center was the HOA president, Karen herself, wearing a pressed blazer and that sharp, self-satisfied smile she always had. "Ah, Mr. Daniels," she said when he walked in. "I see you got our notice." "Yes," he replied, keeping his tone polite. "That's why I'm here. I think there's been a mistake about my pool." Karen folded her hands and tilted her head. "We've received multiple complaints about your pool being used exclusively by your family. As you know, this community has shared standards for amenities." Daniel blinked. "Shared standards? My pool isn't part of any shared area. It's on my property. I built it with a private permit. It's not the community pool. That's the problem," she said flatly. "By constructing a private pool, you've created an unfair distinction between homeowners. The HOA rules prohibit exclusive amenities that set residents apart." He stared at her, speechless for a moment. "You're saying I can't use the pool I built on my own land because other people don't have one?" Karen smiled faintly. "We just want to maintain equality and harmony in the neighborhood. Daniel couldn't help but laugh a little. Equality and harmony. So should I tear down my fence too? Or give everyone a spare key? Her face hardened. There's no need for sarcasm, Mr. Daniels. You can either pay the fine or we can escalate this to legal review. He felt his jaw tighten, but forced himself to stay calm. You do that, he said quietly. And while you're at it, look up my property deed. It clearly shows where my line ends and where community space begins. He left the meeting with that same envelope still in his hand. The fine might have been small, but it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about principle. That night he went through every document he had, permits, inspection papers, even the blueprints. Everything was in perfect order. The city inspector had approved the pool and the fence. There wasn't a single legal reason for the HOA to interfere. He decided to send a formal letter, attaching copies of his documents, demanding that the fine be revoked and all accusations withdrawn. He mailed it and felt confident it would resolve everything, but it didn't. 2 weeks later, another notice arrived. This time the HOA claimed his pool area had not been made accessible for community supervision. There was another fine attached, another $250. Daniel stood in his kitchen reading the letter while his wife looked at him nervously. What are they trying to do? She asked. They can't just make up rules. He rubbed his forehead. I don't know, but it feels like they're testing me, like she's looking for a reason to make my life miserable. He didn't want to believe that. He'd never been one for drama, and he wasn't trying to start any. But every letter, every ridiculous claim made it clearer that this wasn't just about rules. It was personal. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. Whenever Daniel was outside by his pool, he could feel eyes on him. He'd look up and, sure enough, see Karen standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, pretending to walk her dog while staring straight into his yard. Sometimes he'd hear her talking to neighbors, her voice loud enough for him to catch bits and pieces. Against regulations. No community approval. Sets a bad example. One Saturday afternoon, as his kids splashed in the pool, Daniel decided to approach her. He walked over to where she stood near her driveway. Look, he began calmly. I don't know what you think I've done wrong, but this has gone too far. I followed every rule, every law. You need to stop harassing me. She gave him that same tight smile. I'm just doing my job, Mr. Daniels. The HOA expects compliance from everyone. He sighed. Then maybe you should read your own bylaws. There's nothing in there about private pools being shared. Not yet, she said quietly, but we're working on an amendment. That was when Daniel realized she wasn't just enforcing rules. She was trying to make new ones to fit her argument. He walked away, angry, but also determined. If she wanted to fight, he'd fight her, legally, calmly, and with facts. That evening, he called a local attorney who specialized in property and HOA disputes. The lawyer listened carefully as Daniel explained everything, then asked him to bring in the documents the next day. When they met, the lawyer skimmed through the files and shook his head in disbelief. This is nonsense, he said. You own this land outright. The HOA has no jurisdiction over your private pool. They can't fine you for using something that isn't a shared asset. So what do I do? Daniel asked. Send them a formal cease and desist notice. If they keep it up, we'll take them to small claims court. You'll win easily. Daniel left the office feeling a wave of relief wash over him. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he had control again. That night, he sat out by the pool with a cup of coffee. The water shimmered softly under the lights, calm and quiet. It was exactly the kind of peace he wanted when he built it. He couldn't imagine how something so simple, so normal, had turned into a battle. But one thing was certain, he wasn't backing down. As the sound of crickets filled the air and the last traces of sunlight faded, Daniel made himself a silent promise. He would protect what he had built, no matter how many letters or fines they threw his way. Somewhere down the street, he could hear Karen's voice talking to another neighbor, her tone sharp and commanding as always. But Daniel didn't flinch. He just leaned back in his chair, eyes on the calm water, and whispered to himself, Let's see how far she wants to take this. He didn't know it yet. But the real fight was just beginning. Days turned into weeks. But the tension between Daniel and the HOA didn't fade. If anything, it grew worse. The morning after he mailed the cease and desist notice through his lawyer, he found another envelope in his mailbox. This time it wasn't just a fine. It was a formal warning of potential legal action. He didn't even bother to open it right away. He took a deep breath. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stared out at his backyard. The pool glistened under the early light, perfectly still. It should have made him feel proud, but now it just reminded him of the headache that came with it. Later that day, he sat at his kitchen table with the letter finally opened. It accused him of disrupting neighborhood harmony and refusing cooperative resolution. He couldn't help but laugh. The only one disrupting harmony was the woman sending these letters. He called his lawyer again, and after reviewing the new notice, the lawyer told him to keep everything for record. "They're bluffing," he said. "She's trying to intimidate you into backing down. Keep your documentation and don't respond emotionally." Daniel followed that advice, but it wasn't easy. Every time he stepped outside, he could feel Karen's eyes on him. She'd walk her dog near his house at least twice a day, always stopping long enough to look through the fence. Once, she even brought a measuring tape. He tried to ignore her, focusing on work, on family, on anything that wasn't HOA nonsense. But ignoring her didn't make her stop. The next letter claimed his pool lighting was distracting to neighboring homes. Then it was his non-standard lawn decor. Then, somehow his recycling bins were visible from the main road. Each letter came with a warning or fine attached. It became a routine. Every few days, another envelope. Another reason to shake his head. One evening, Daniel was grilling outside when his next-door neighbor, a quiet man named Tim, came over through the gate. He had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone and had seen more than his share of HOA drama. "Hey," Tim said softly, lowering his voice. "I thought you should know something." Daniel set down his tongs. "What's up?" "I was at the last HOA board meeting," Tim said. "They spent almost half the time talking about your pool." "Seriously?" "Yeah," Tim nodded. Karen was pushing for a vote to classify it as a community access feature. She said it was originally built too close to the shared zone. Daniel frowned. "That's completely false. The inspector signed off on everything." "I know," Tim said, "but she's convincing people that you somehow bent the rules. A couple of them believe her." Daniel felt a mix of disbelief and anger. "So she's rewriting the rules now?" Tim shrugged. "That's what it looks like. You might want to show up at the next meeting." "She's getting bold." Daniel thanked him and decided then and there he'd go. Enough was enough. The next HOA meeting was held the following Tuesday. When Daniel walked into the hall, all eyes turned toward him. Some people smiled in quiet support, but others looked uneasy. Karen sat in the front, her folder stacked with papers, wearing that same smug look that made Daniel's stomach twist. He sat down and waited as the meeting began. They went through small items first: lawn maintenance, parking, and neighborhood watch schedules. Then finally Karen said, "Next on the agenda is the discussion regarding unauthorized private structures impacting community access." Everyone knew what that meant. She stood up and began explaining how one homeowner's pool had been causing disputes and confusion about accessibility. She showed photos of Daniel's pool, taken from behind her fence, clearly without permission, and called it a misuse of shared property boundaries. Daniel raised his hand. "Those photos were taken from my backyard line. That's trespassing, by the way." Karen smiled without looking at him. "Please hold your comments until the end, Mr. Daniels." He clenched his jaw, biting back the urge to interrupt. She continued, "We propose that private pools constructed without board supervision should be open for limited neighborhood use, to maintain fairness and uphold community spirit." That was it. Daniel stood up. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, voice calm but sharp. "You want to turn my backyard into a public pool? I paid for it. I maintain it. You didn't contribute a single cent." Karen crossed her arms. "We're not saying anyone can just walk in. But we need to make sure there's equal access. Otherwise, it sets an unfair example." He looked around the room. "Does anyone else actually agree with this?" A few people looked away. A couple nodded hesitantly, clearly pressured by Karen. But others shook their heads. "This isn't about fairness," Daniel said. "This is about control. You're using HOA power to bully people who don't bend to you. And it's wrong." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Please lower your tone, Mr. Daniels. We're trying to resolve this civilly." He laughed under his breath. "Civilly? You've sent me 5 fines for nonsense. You've taken pictures of my yard without permission. That's not civil." The tension in the room was thick. One of the other board members finally spoke up. Maybe we should table this discussion for now. Karen pursed her lips but agreed. Fine. We'll revisit it next month. As Daniel left the room, a few neighbors quietly approached him, saying they supported him but didn't want to get involved publicly. He thanked them anyway, though inside he felt frustrated. People were afraid of her, and she used that fear to get her way. When he got home, he sat by the pool again. The water reflected the lights from the house, calm as ever. But he couldn't relax. He knew this wasn't over. Over the next week, Karen's behavior escalated. He caught her standing by his driveway one morning, snapping photos again. When he asked her what she was doing, she said she was documenting violations. He told her to leave, and she walked away with a fake smile. That evening, another notice arrived. This one claimed that his behavior toward HOA officials was inappropriate and aggressive. That was the moment Daniel realized this wasn't going to stop unless he made it stop. He decided to bring everything public. He started by posting his story on a local neighborhood forum. He didn't use insults or anger, just facts. He shared the timeline, the letters, the fines, and even the ridiculous meeting proposal. He ended the post by saying, "If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone." The post exploded overnight. Comments poured in from people who had dealt with similar issues. Some even shared their own experiences of being harassed by HOAs or unfairly fined. Others from his own neighborhood chimed in, saying they had always found the rules too strict but were too scared to speak up. Karen must have seen it, because the next day, he found another envelope. This one said he had violated community communication ethics by posting sensitive HOA information publicly. He laughed out loud reading that one. He didn't take the post down. In fact, he shared more updates, carefully keeping everything polite and factual. Soon his story spread beyond the neighborhood. Local people started commenting, expressing disbelief that a private homeowner could be fined for using his own pool. A few days later, a local reporter reached out to him, asking if he'd be willing to talk about it. Daniel hesitated at first, but after thinking about it, he agreed. He figured sunlight was the best disinfectant. The reporter came by, took photos, and asked him to explain the situation. Daniel kept it professional. He didn't insult anyone. He just described what happened. The article was published under the headline, "Homeowner Fined by HOA for Using His Own Pool." It gained traction quickly. Neighbors stopped him during walks to say they'd read it and were on his side. Even people who had never talked to him before started waving and smiling. Karen, however, was furious. He could tell by the way she glared at him when their paths crossed. 2 days after the article came out, she sent another letter claiming the fence around his pool violated new visual harmony guidelines. The timing made it obvious she was retaliating. Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he called his lawyer again. "I think it's time," he said. The lawyer agreed. Together, they drafted a legal notice demanding the HOA cease all harassment and retract the fines immediately, or face a lawsuit for defamation and property interference. They mailed it with signature confirmation. For a while, things got quiet. No new letters. No Karen standing by the fence. No strange HOA visits. Daniel thought maybe she had finally realized she couldn't win this battle. But then one afternoon, while he was at work, he got a notification from his security camera. Movement detected in the backyard. When he opened the app, his jaw dropped. There were 2 kids swimming in his pool, kids he didn't recognize. He rushed home immediately. When he arrived, the kids were still there, and one of them sheepishly said, "Mrs. Karen said it's okay, it's the neighborhood pool." Daniel could hardly believe it. "She said what?" "She said the HOA owns it now," one of them replied. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He politely asked them to leave, and they did, but his hands were shaking with anger. He checked his camera footage and saved everything. He called his lawyer again, who told him to document every single thing and send a report to the police for trespassing, even if he didn't press charges yet. That night, he sat by the pool again, staring at the rippling water. The peace that once came from it was gone. Now it felt like a symbol of the fight he never asked for but was forced into. He made up his mind that night. Enough was enough. If she thought she could control his property, she was wrong. He was going to guard what was his and make sure everyone knew exactly where his boundaries stood, literally and legally. This was no longer just about a pool. It was about standing up for himself, for fairness, and for every homeowner who had ever been bullied by people hiding behind a title. The next morning, he ordered new cameras, a taller privacy fence, and a clear private property no trespassing sign. He wasn't backing down because now, it wasn't just his pool. It was his stand. The morning air was still when Daniel started installing the new fence. The sound of the power drill echoed through the neighborhood, breaking the quiet. He worked steadily, sweating under the sun, determined to finish before noon. Every bolt he tightened, every wooden board he secured, felt like a small act of defiance. This was his home, his land, his pool, and no one was going to take that from him. By afternoon, the new privacy fence was up. Taller, sturdier, and impossible to see through. It wasn't about hiding anything. It was about drawing a line that couldn't be crossed. He added a clear sign on the gate that read, "Private property, no trespassing." When he stepped back and looked at it, he felt a strange mix of exhaustion and pride. He had never wanted to turn his home into a fortress, but sometimes peace required a little protection. Later that day, he checked his security cameras again. Nothing unusual until he noticed someone standing at the edge of the street, arms folded. It was Karen. She stayed there for a few minutes, staring at the new fence, probably furious that she couldn't peek inside anymore. Then she pulled out her phone, took a few pictures, and walked away. Daniel sighed, shaking his head. He knew another letter was coming. Sure enough, 2 days later, there it was. Another envelope from the HOA. This one said his new fence was in violation of community visual standards, and that it restricted access to shared monitoring zones. He almost laughed at the last part. Shared monitoring zones? That wasn't even a real term. He didn't bother replying this time. Instead, he forwarded the letter to his lawyer. Within hours, his lawyer emailed back saying, "Don't worry, I'll handle it." That evening, Daniel was sitting by the pool, finally starting to feel a little calm again when his neighbor Tim stopped by. "Man, you've stirred up quite the storm," Tim said with a small grin. "I didn't stir anything. I just built a fence," Daniel said. Tim nodded. "Yeah, but you know how she is. She doesn't like losing control. Word is she's been calling emergency board meetings every other night about you." Daniel chuckled quietly. "Let her have her meetings. I'm not breaking any laws." Tim looked around at the new fence and lowered his voice. "Good job with this, by the way. Makes her crazy that she can't see in." Daniel smiled. "That's kind of the point." For the first time in weeks, he actually slept peacefully that night. But that peace didn't last long. The following weekend, he woke up to the sound of shouting. When he stepped outside, he saw Karen standing at the end of his driveway, arguing with a delivery driver. The man looked confused, holding a package. "Excuse me," Daniel called out, walking over. "What's going on?" Karen turned sharply. This delivery truck was blocking the street. "That's against HOA policy." The driver looked helpless. "I was just dropping off a package for him." Daniel sighed. "He's fine, Karen. He's just doing his job." Karen frowned. "The HOA expects all residents to follow proper traffic guidelines." "Then maybe you should write yourself a ticket," Daniel said quietly. "You're blocking the sidewalk." Her face turned red. "Excuse me?" Daniel stayed calm. "You've made my life miserable for weeks. I'm done arguing. Leave my property and stop harassing people who come here." Karen glared at him for a long moment, then spun around and walked away without another word. The delivery driver muttered a quick thank you and hurried off. After that, Daniel knew things were going to get worse before they got better. Over the next few days, he noticed small things. His mailbox being slightly open when he hadn't checked it yet. His trash cans moved from where he left them. Footprints near the back fence. It felt like someone was snooping again. He reviewed his camera footage and saw a few shadows near the fence line one evening, but the images weren't clear enough to identify anyone. Still, he saved everything. He decided it was time to let the HOA higher-ups know what was happening. Every HOA had an oversight committee at the city level, and Daniel gathered all his evidence, letters, photos, timestamps, even the trespassing footage, and mailed a detailed complaint. A week later, he got a call. "Mr. Daniels," the voice said, "we've received your report. We're opening an investigation into your HOA's conduct." That was the first bit of good news in a long time, but it didn't stop Karen. If anything, it seemed to make her more desperate. She started showing up at other people's houses, telling them Daniel was dangerous and unstable. A few neighbors even told him that she was warning them not to take sides. One afternoon, he came home from work to find a notice posted on his front door. It said there would be a mandatory inspection of his property for community compliance. The date listed was the following Monday. He knew what that meant. She was planning to show up at his house again. Monday morning came and Daniel sat out on his porch waiting. Around 10 a.m., Karen showed up, clipboard in hand with 2 other board members following her. "Good morning," she said in that overly polite voice that always meant trouble. "We're here for the scheduled inspection." Daniel stood up. "No, you're not. You don't have permission to enter my property." She smiled tightly. "HOA regulations allow for periodic inspections. Not without my consent," he said. "And since this is private property, I'm asking you to leave." One of the board members looked uncomfortable. "Maybe we should come back later," he said softly. Karen shot him a glare. "We're not leaving. We're here to confirm compliance." Daniel took out his phone. "Then I'm calling the police for trespassing." Karen froze, clearly not expecting that. "There's no need for that." "I think there is," Daniel replied calmly. "You've ignored every letter, every warning. You're not welcome here." Within minutes, a patrol car pulled up. The officer stepped out, listened to both sides, and then asked Daniel to show his documents. Daniel handed over the property deed and the legal letters his lawyer had sent. After looking them over, the officer turned to Karen. "Ma'am, this man's property line is clear. You can't come onto his property without permission. You need to leave." Karen tried to argue, but the officer cut her off. "You've been warned. If you return without consent, it'll be trespassing." For the first time, Daniel saw Karen look genuinely shaken. She gathered her papers, turned sharply, and walked away without saying another word. The other board members followed quietly. When the officer left, Daniel stood there in his yard feeling the weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't total victory, but it was something. That night, he sat by the pool again, the soft ripples reflecting the lights of the house. For once, the air felt still and peaceful. His wife came out with 2 glasses of lemonade and sat beside him. "Maybe it's finally over," she said softly. He smiled. "Maybe, but I'll stay ready just in case." The next few days were surprisingly calm. No letters, no photos, no unwanted visitors. The neighborhood felt normal again. Some people even started talking to him more openly, thanking him for standing up. Then one evening, Tim came by again, looking both amused and impressed. "You won't believe what I just heard," he said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What now?" "She got a warning from the HOA Oversight Board. Apparently they're auditing her. They're checking the financial records and rule changes." Daniel smiled slowly. "About time." Tim laughed. "Guess your complaint actually worked." For the first time in months, Daniel felt a genuine sense of relief. He had fought back, stood his ground, and now the truth was starting to catch up to her. But even as he smiled, part of him stayed cautious. He knew people like her didn't give up easily. They thrived on control, and losing it could make them unpredictable. Sure enough, a few days later, Daniel noticed something odd. There was a small flyer slipped under his door, unsigned but clearly written in Karen's style. It accused him of undermining community leadership and warned residents about people who don't follow neighborhood harmony. He just shook his head, crumpled it up, and tossed it into the trash. That weekend, he hosted a quiet barbecue for a few neighbors. Just burgers, laughter, and an evening by the pool. It wasn't a statement, just a moment to enjoy what he had worked for. As they ate and talked, Daniel realized something had changed. People weren't whispering anymore. They were openly laughing, relaxed, and happy to be there. The tension that had hung over the neighborhood for months was fading. At one point, Tim raised his glass and said, "To standing up for yourself." Daniel smiled. "To peace and privacy." Everyone laughed, and for once it felt like the neighborhood was healing. When the evening ended and everyone left, Daniel stayed outside a little longer. The stars were out and the water was calm again. He thought about everything that had happened, the letters, the meetings, the shouting, the endless stress, and how it all started from something as simple as a pool. He didn't regret any of it, because sometimes peace had to be protected. Sometimes the only way to keep what was yours was to fight for it, with patience, proof, and persistence. As he leaned back in his chair, the faint sound of crickets filled the air. He smiled quietly to himself, thinking, maybe this was the turning point. Maybe finally the storm was passing. But deep down, Daniel knew the story wasn't finished. There was still one more chapter left before everything would truly settle, and when that time came, he'd be ready. The next few weeks passed quietly, almost too quietly. Daniel had begun to feel something he hadn't felt in months: peace. The pool sparkled again, the garden looked alive, and the evenings were calm. The air no longer felt heavy when he walked through the neighborhood. He started noticing small but meaningful changes. The neighbors who used to avoid eye contact now waved when they saw him. The couple across the street who had stayed silent during the drama even stopped by one evening to thank him. "We were scared to speak up before," the man admitted. "You gave us the courage to say enough." Daniel appreciated their words, but he didn't let himself relax completely. He knew Karen well enough by now to understand she wasn't done. One Friday morning, as he was drinking coffee on the porch, his wife stepped outside holding her phone. "You might want to see this," she said softly. On the neighborhood social app, someone had posted a long message accusing Daniel of turning the neighborhood against leadership. It didn't mention his name directly, but it didn't have to. Everyone knew who it was about. Daniel exhaled slowly. "She's at it again," he muttered. His wife frowned. "Just ignore it. Everyone can see through her by now." He nodded, but part of him knew that ignoring her wasn't enough. This time, he needed to finish it. Properly. That afternoon, he called his lawyer again and asked about the Oversight Board's investigation. The lawyer replied, "It's in motion. They've requested documents and are reviewing financial decisions. It might take a few weeks, but progress is happening." That was enough to give Daniel hope. The following weekend, he decided to take back his peace completely. He invited a few neighbors over for another small get-together. Just coffee, snacks, and simple conversation. For the first time, people laughed freely in his backyard. They talked about their jobs, kids, and weekend plans, things that felt normal again. Halfway through, one of the neighbors, an older woman named Mrs. Taylor, leaned in and said quietly, "You know, Daniel, you did something brave. Most people just give up when the HOA pushes back. You didn't," Daniel smiled. "I didn't want to live scared in my own home." She nodded slowly. That's exactly what we all needed to hear. The evening went on peacefully, and when everyone left, Daniel sat by the pool again, watching the reflection of the sky on the water. It was beautiful, calm, soft, and quiet. But that peace didn't last long. The next morning, he received an email from the HOA. The subject line read, "Emergency board meeting, attendance required." He rolled his eyes. "Here we go again," he said under his breath. When he opened the email, it said the meeting would be held the next evening at the community hall, and attendance was mandatory for all residents affected by recent disputes. The message didn't explain more, but Daniel knew this was about him. He debated whether to go or not. Part of him wanted to ignore it, but another part of him wanted to face them, to show he wasn't intimidated. After a long talk with his wife, he decided to go. The next evening, the hall was already half full when Daniel walked in. The usual faces were there, a mix of neighbors who looked curious, tired, or simply bored. Karen sat at the front, papers neatly stacked in front of her, pretending to look professional. When Daniel took a seat near the back, a few neighbors nodded politely. Karen cleared her throat and began, "Thank you all for coming on short notice. We've called this meeting to address ongoing disruptions in our community harmony." Her voice was calm, but her eyes were sharp. She went on, talking about non-compliance, the negative influence, and unapproved modifications. It was all clearly directed at him, even though she never said his name. Finally, she looked up and said, "At this point, I would like to open the floor for comments." Daniel raised his hand. Karen hesitated for a moment but nodded. "Go ahead." He stood up slowly. "I've listened to every word you said," he began, his voice steady but firm. "And I need to ask, how exactly have I disrupted harmony? By building a legal fence? By protecting my home? Or by refusing to let someone trespass on my property?" There were a few murmurs in the crowd. Karen tried to interrupt, but Daniel continued. "Let's be clear. Every change I made followed the city's code. Every inspection was cleared. The only issue seems to be that one person decided to make my private choices her business." Karen's jaw tightened. "You're out of line, Daniel." He looked at her calmly. "No, I'm finally in line, the law's line." That got a few quiet chuckles from the back of the room. He went on, "We're supposed to be neighbors, not enemies. But for months I've received threats, fines, and false notices, all because I refused to be bullied. That's not community spirit. That's harassment." Karen turned red. "Those notices were standard procedure." "Then why?" Daniel said, taking out his phone. "Did the oversight board confirm they were unauthorized?" The room went silent. He projected an email onto the wall. A clear message from the oversight committee, stating that certain notices were issued without board approval and that the HOA was under review. Karen froze, completely speechless. The other board members looked at each other nervously. Finally, one of them spoke. "We weren't told about that," he said quietly. Daniel looked around the room. "This isn't about me or her anymore. It's about how we let one person control us with fear. We all deserve peace in our homes. Isn't that why we live here?" For the first time, people started nodding openly, even the ones who had stayed neutral before. Karen tried to regain control. "We can't discuss private board matters here," she said quickly. But the damage was done. After the meeting ended, Daniel walked out, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders again. Several neighbors came up to him, shaking his hand. "You handled that perfectly," one said. Another whispered, "She needed to be called out." When he got home, his wife was waiting by the door. "How'd it go?" He smiled. "Better than I expected." That night he slept deeply. No more worry, no more stress, just quiet. Over the next week, the atmosphere around the neighborhood shifted. Karen stopped sending messages. The HOA didn't issue any more letters. The gossip stopped too. People started talking about gardening, school events, and weekend plans again. Normal things. Then one morning, Daniel received a letter. But this one wasn't from the HOA. It was from the oversight board. He opened it slowly. The letter stated that after reviewing the case, they found multiple breaches of conduct within the HOA's internal procedures. It went on to say that the board president was being removed pending a formal audit. Daniel just stared at it for a moment, hardly believing it. Then he smiled, not out of triumph, but out of relief. It was finally over. Later that day, Tim came by, holding his own copy of the same letter. "Looks like she's out," he said with a grin. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, it took long enough," Tim laughed. "Man, you really did it. You actually stood up to her and won." Daniel shook his head. "I didn't win. The truth did." Over the next few days, the community started feeling different. People seemed lighter, more relaxed. Without Karen's constant pressure, the neighborhood slowly began to feel like a neighborhood again. The HOA brought in an interim board, fair, polite people who wanted to fix things instead of control them. They met with Daniel personally to apologize for everything that had happened. One of them said, "You were right to speak up. What she did wasn't just unfair, it was unethical." Daniel thanked them but didn't dwell on it. He just wanted peace. That weekend, he finally decided to do something he hadn't done since the whole mess started. He invited everyone over for a big pool day. Kids splashed in the water. Adults chatted and laughed, and for once, the sound of joy filled the air again. There was no tension, no glares, no judgment, just people being neighbors. At one point, Mrs. Taylor came over and said, "You know, Daniel, you reminded us that we don't have to be afraid to live freely." He smiled. "I just wanted to enjoy my home." As the sun set, painting the sky orange and pink, Daniel sat back and watched everyone enjoying themselves. It felt right again. The laughter, the music, the smell of grilled food, everything that had been missing for so long. When everyone left that evening, Daniel and his wife sat quietly by the pool. She looked at him and said softly, "It's strange how much one person can change everything, for better or worse." He nodded. "Yeah, but sometimes it just takes one person to stand up to make it right again." For a long time they sat in silence, listening to the gentle sound of the water. Then she smiled. "Do you realize this is the first time in months we've had dinner without talking about the HOA?" Daniel laughed. "I'll drink to that." They clinked glasses, and for the first time it truly felt like peace had come home again. Later that night, after his wife went inside, Daniel stayed out for a while longer. He looked up at the stars and thought about everything that had happened. The letters, the stress, the confrontation, the exhaustion. But most of all, he thought about what he learned. That standing up for yourself doesn't always mean fighting loud battles. Sometimes it means staying calm, gathering facts, and holding your ground no matter how hard someone tries to push you down. He had been tested, but he hadn't broken. And now, as the gentle breeze moved across the water, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Peace that was truly earned. He turned off the pool lights, smiled softly, and whispered to himself, "Finally home." The days after the whole HOA drama ended felt like a new beginning for Daniel. For the first time in months, he could wake up, open the blinds, and not feel that little spike of anxiety about what might be waiting in his mailbox. The yellow envelopes were gone. The tension that had wrapped around his home like a storm cloud had finally lifted. He still checked his mail every morning, though, just out of habit. The first few days he almost expected another notice or some new made-up rule, but there were none. Only normal things, bills, grocery flyers, and the occasional friendly note from a neighbor thanking him for standing up to what everyone had quietly tolerated for far too long. Life started feeling normal again. The air smelled cleaner, the sun seemed brighter, and the sound of kids laughing in the distance didn't carry that edge of worry anymore. Daniel had never wanted to be the center of attention. He wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed conflict or spotlight moments, but somehow he'd become both. The man who stood up to the HOA and the one who showed the neighborhood what courage looked like. At first, it was strange. People he'd barely spoken to before would stop by when he was gardening, just to chat or offer to help with something. One older gentleman, Mr. Reynolds, even brought him homemade lemonade one hot afternoon. "You gave all of us our peace back," he said with a proud smile. I was tired of living scared in my own house. Daniel didn't know what to say. He just nodded, humbled by it all. He hadn't fought the HOA for praise. He did it because it was right, because he was tired of watching unfairness win. But hearing those words from his neighbors made him realize something deeper. When one person stands up, others find their strength too. The new HOA board held their first community meeting a few weeks later. This time there was no tension, no unspoken hostility. The chairs were full, but people smiled, laughed, and even joked around. The atmosphere was completely different. The new board president, a calm, level-headed man named Mr. Watson, began by saying, "We're here to rebuild trust. We want to make this community fair again." Everyone clapped. Then he added, "We also want to thank Daniel for his patience and for showing us what accountability should look like." Daniel felt a bit embarrassed when people turned to clap again, but it was genuine. He just nodded politely, smiling. It wasn't about recognition, it was about closure. After the meeting, Mr. Watson approached him personally. "You handled yourself with dignity," he said. "That's rare these days. If you're ever interested in joining the board, we could use someone with your sense of fairness." Daniel laughed softly. "I appreciate that, but I think I've had enough HOA politics for a lifetime." Mr. Watson chuckled. "Can't blame you there." The weeks that followed were peaceful. The pool became the family's favorite place again. On warm evenings, Daniel would light the string lamps around the fence, play soft music, and let his kids swim while he and his wife sat by the water with iced tea. Sometimes, he'd just sit there alone after everyone went to bed, listening to the soft ripple of the water and thinking about how different things felt. The silence that used to feel heavy now felt healing. One quiet evening, as he was cleaning around the pool, he saw a car slowly pull up near the curb. The headlights dimmed and someone stepped out. It was Karen. For a moment, Daniel froze. He hadn't seen her since she was removed from the HOA board. Word around the neighborhood was that she had moved out temporarily after the investigation started. He hadn't expected her to come back. She stood by the sidewalk, hesitant, holding a small envelope. Her usual sharp expression was gone. She looked tired, like someone who had been carrying too much for too long. Daniel didn't say anything at first. He just watched as she took a step closer to the fence. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said quietly. "I just wanted to give you this." She held out the envelope. Daniel hesitated before walking over to the fence and taking it. "What is it?" he asked calmly. "A letter," she said. "An apology." He didn't respond right away. She looked down at the ground and sighed. "I know I went too far. I told myself I was protecting the community, but really, I was just trying to control it. I let my own bitterness guide me, and you didn't deserve that." Her voice cracked slightly, and for a second, Daniel saw something he hadn't expected. Remorse. "I ruined my own peace," she went on. And I ruined yours too. I'm sorry for that. Daniel studied her for a moment. He could have said a lot of things. He could have reminded her of the months of stress, the letters, the embarrassment. But instead he took a deep breath and said quietly, "Thank you for saying that." Karen nodded, almost surprised by his calmness. "I'm moving out next month," she said softly. "I think it's time for a fresh start somewhere else." He simply nodded. "I hope you find peace wherever you go." She looked at him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You already have." And with that, she turned and walked back to her car. Daniel stood there for a moment after she left, holding the letter in his hand. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at it under the soft glow of the light. When he finally opened it, the words were simple, an honest apology written in shaky handwriting. She admitted to everything, the lies, the false notices, even the way she had manipulated the board to maintain control. It was all there. But at the end, she had written one final line that stood out more than the rest. "Peace isn't something we enforce. It's something we protect." Daniel read that line several times, then folded the letter and put it away in a drawer. He didn't need to keep it as proof of anything. It was simply a reminder that sometimes even the people who cause chaos are capable of understanding it later. Life carried on. Months passed, and the neighborhood began to thrive again. People planted flowers, hosted barbecues, and smiled more. The energy was lighter. There were no more secret grudges or hidden rivalries. Daniel even noticed that people had started to use the pool area as inspiration for their own homes. A few neighbors began building small decks, improving their yards, or putting up lights. It wasn't about competition anymore, it was about community. One day, Mr. Watson stopped by again, smiling proudly. "We're planning a neighborhood summer festival," he said. "Would you mind hosting part of it in your yard? Maybe around the pool area?" Daniel hesitated for a second, then smiled. "Sure, why not?" When the day came, the neighborhood gathered in his backyard. There was laughter, music, and kids running around with popsicles. The pool shimmered under the sun, and everyone seemed happy, free from the fear that had once filled the air. Even Daniel's wife couldn't help but laugh when she saw how full their yard was. Who would have thought the pool that started all the trouble would bring everyone together? Daniel grinned. Funny how things work out, huh? As the sun started to set, someone brought out a small cake and surprised Daniel with it. On top, written in icing, were the words, "Thank you for standing up." He laughed, shaking his head. "You didn't have to do this." Mrs. Taylor smiled and said, "Maybe not. But you reminded us that kindness and courage still matter." He smiled softly, touched by her words. As the night went on, lanterns lit up the yard, and people shared stories. There was no talk of fines or rules, just laughter and friendship. The sound of the pool's gentle waves mixed with the murmur of joy around him. Later, when everyone had gone home, Daniel stayed outside again, the air cool and calm. The lights reflected off the water just like they had the first night the pool was built. He thought about how everything had come full circle, from the frustration and anger to peace and community. It was strange how one situation could change so much. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the crickets, and smiled. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about what could go wrong. He was just grateful, for the lessons, for the peace, and for the people who stood by him when things got hard. His wife stepped outside quietly, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed him one and sat beside him. "Do you ever think about how different things would have been if you'd just given in?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Sometimes. But then I remember that standing up wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who needed to see it could be done." She rested her head on his shoulder. "You did good." He looked out at the pool, the lights dancing on the surface. "We did good." They sat there for a long time, watching the night sky, and though life would move on, Daniel knew one thing for sure. Peace wasn't just something he had earned, it was something he'd built. Piece by piece, with patience, truth, and quiet strength. As the moonlight reflected over the water, he whispered softly, "It's finally over." His wife smiled, and the soft sound of the water became the only reply he needed. The story that began with fines and fights had ended with peace and unity. And in that still moment, surrounded by calm, Daniel realized something simple yet powerful. Sometimes, the hardest battles lead to the most peaceful victories. He turned off the lights, walked back inside, and felt a quiet happiness settle in his heart. The home was calm, the world was quiet, and life finally was exactly how it was meant to be.